Okay, fire away, Michael.
Hello everyone and welcome to this training session on biodiversity net gain for watercourses. All very welcome. Just to make you aware in terms of other training that's available on biodiversity net gain, what you see on the slide there to the left is on the Environment Agency SharePoint site and the different recordings and events that are available at the different levels. Then on the right, you have a link to that Environment Agency site for those colleagues. For Natural England colleagues, there's a link to the BNG SharePoint site. And then for all colleagues, bottom right is a Natural England BNG SharePoint site that can be used by Natural England Environment Agency and Forestry Commission, and which over the next month or so will be updated with the latest training recordings now that we have mandatory biodiversity net gain for major applications. Just one note on the bottom SharePoint site, any NEA will gain automatic access to it. FC, when you click on the link, it'll ask you to request access. Once you've requested access, you will automatically be given it, but apologies that there's that one extra step just because of the IT. So moving on from that, talking about today's learning outcomes. After this morning, you'll understand the timelines after mandatory biodiversity net gain for major applications, which came into effect on the 12th of February 2024, as I'm sure you'll know. You'll also be aware of the rules and principles that underpin the metric and its ecological context. And you'll also have a broad understanding of biodiversity net gain for watercourses. Importantly, what's the same and what's different. And also you'll know where to go for further information and resources. Our presenters today, firstly, will be Finn Goddard. He is a senior specialist in our statutory biodiversity metric team that sits within the Chief Scientist Directorate in Natural England. We're also joined by Sarah Scott. She's a senior advisor in the Environment Agency for biodiversity net gain and built the watercourse module of the metric. In addition, from Environment Agency, we're joined by Oliver Grant. He's an advisor in the National Geomorphology team. And we're also joined by Lucy Shuker, an external consultant who's been part of the development of the river condition assessment, working closely with DEFRA, Environment Agency and Natural England in this regard over many years. And we're delighted to have her with her today. Please note that when you're reviewing the slides, there may well be presenter notes that refer to user guides or additional information. Before I hand over to the main presenters, just some key points and then the timelines after 12th of February. A reminder that biodiversity net gain currently applies to England only. As you know, mandatory biodiversity net gain commenced for all large-scale major developments on the 12th of February 2024. What that means is any application submitted on that date and afterwards, apart from the few exemptions, but all applications submitted before that date, regardless of when approval happens for those, remain exempt from BNG. So BNG for major applications applies to those applications submitted on or after the 12th of February 2024. And also importantly, another reminder that biodiversity net gain doesn't replace or diminish any current protection for biodiversity. The regulations around BNG and the metric itself sit alongside those regulations, adding additional protection for nature. So in short, any regulation, consent, license, piece of paperwork, anything that you currently have to do still is required. In terms of the timeline after the 12th of February, now that major applications have to apply 10% biodiversity net gain, a reminder that developments undertaken on small sites, so that's less than a hectare, 9 dwellings or less, will need to comply with BNG requirements from Tuesday the 2nd of April 2024. And similarly, what that date means is applications submitted on that date and afterwards will need to comply. For nationally significant infrastructure projects, the date is November 2025. This was because NSIPs weren't included at Environment Bill stage, but fortunately were by Environment Act stage, hence the different timeline. We are expecting a consultation on NSIPs in the spring of this year, with a response from the government to that consultation in autumn of this year. The price of statutory biodiversity credits will be reviewed every 6 months and may or may not change, but the statutory biodiversity metric will be reviewed on a 3 to 5 year cycle. Importantly, any changes that are required to the calculation would require a public consultation. There will be a public consultation on irreplaceable habitats later this year, and there will be updates to guidance on gov.uk on an ongoing iterative basis. What may happen over the next few years are consequential amendments. Consequential amendments refers to the parliamentary process and the way in which any amendments to the Environment Act would be required. And just a final reminder that for marine net gain, there is currently no timeline. The latest information with regard to marine net gain is the government response to the public consultation on the principles of marine net gain, URL link to that at the bottom of the slide. So that brings us up to date on where we are and where we are going forwards. Now I'll hand you over to Finn Goddard, Senior Specialist for the Metric team, to start the main presentation. Thanks, Finn.
Thanks, Michael. So probably most of you know roughly how to calculate your 10% net gain, which is you calculate your baseline, then you calculate your post-intervention, and you take your baseline away from your post-intervention, and that gives you your net change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over very briefly what goes into biodiversity units, both at the baseline and post-intervention, and then give you a brief overview of the rules and principles that govern around the metrics. So at your baseline, the multipliers that go into it, you have your habitat area / length. So anything that is linear and anything linear, so watercourses and hedgerows and lines of trees are all measured in kilometres, whereas everything else, so your woodlands and your grasslands, measured in hectares. You've got your condition, which is a measure of each habitat against the optimum for that habitat. So it would be for that particular grassland, it could be poor, moderate, or good condition. You've got your distinctiveness, which is preset value for that habitat. And then you've got your strategic significance, which is the habitat's local significance based on its type and location and local plans and things like that. Distinctiveness is preset by the metric, so you don't have to worry about that. It just automatically gets input, whereas all the other three are inputted by the user manually. Next slide, please, Michael. So then you've got your post-intervention biodiversity units. So they use all the same multipliers as the baseline units, except there are a few extra difficulty multipliers. So you've got your difficulty multipliers, which are represents the uncertainty in the effective management. So how hard it's going to be to actually create that habitat and whether you're going to actually achieve it. You've got your time to target conditions. So that's the average amount of time it takes to create that habitat and reach the condition that you've said you're going to reach. And then you've got your spatial risk, which only applies to off-site interventions. And that's based on the location of the off-site location against the on-site that you're compensating against. Essentially, the further away it is, the less units you're going to generate. So principles and rules. So there are 9 principles and 4 rules. The metric is governed by them. Essentially, the principles are kind of for the context of net gain, and the rules are things you have to follow to achieve your net gain result. So the first principle is competency. So the metric should be completed by a competent person. That's someone that can identify the habitats on site and is skilled enough to complete the metric. An exact definition of competency is included in the user guide. Principle 2 is the metric does not change anything in terms of existing protections and processes that are already out there. So anything that is already protected by legislation, it's still essentially in place. This doesn't override anything. Everything's still there. Principle 3 builds on principle 2, and that's essentially that best practice guidance should always still be followed. So the metric doesn't overrule any of that. Everything should still be completed in accordance with established best practice guidance. Principle 4 is that the metric is not a complex or comprehensive ecological model. Essentially, the metric is not the be all and end all. It doesn't take everything into account. It's not a, it doesn't counteract professional judgment. So it still needs to be used in accordance with everything else. Principle 5 kind of builds on that as well. So that's that the biodiversity units are proxy values for biodiversity based on habitat type. They're not an absolute measure of biodiversity. They're just taken as a proxy, and that should always be remembered. Principle 6 is that the metric is an information tool. And much like I said before, it doesn't replace ecological judgment. It's basically just there to calculate units. So you should always use ecological judgment in addition to the metric. Principle 7 is that all interventions should be appropriate and deliverable within a relevant project time frame. So you shouldn't suggest interventions that are just completely unachievable. And generally, they should be delivered in 30 years, which is the legal timeframe for BNG. Principle 8 is that all compensation should be local and strategically important, and that is reinforced by the spatial risk multiplier that I mentioned earlier. So you will be awarded greater for doing that, but you should always bear in mind that everything should be local and strategically important. And principle 9 is that there is not a direct compensation ratio for habitats. So with all the multipliers that I spoke about before, you could have a much smaller habitat that's much higher value than a much larger habitat. It's not just a measure of replacing one area for the exact same area. So in summary, principle 1, metric must be completed by a competent person. Principle 2, the metric does not override existing protections. Principle 3, existing professional best practice still applies. Principle 4, the metric is not a complex ecological model. Principle 5, the metric offers a proxy for biodiversity. It's not an exact measure. Principle 6, the metric is designed to inform decisions and not make them. Principle 7, interventions must be appropriate and realistic. Principle 8, compensation should be local and strategic. And Principle 9, there's no minimum habitat size ratio. So that leads me on to the rules. So there's 4 rules, and these must be followed. So rule 1 is the trading rules. So the trading rules must be followed at all times. So the trading rules are governed by distinctiveness, which I went into earlier. So all the habitats have their preset distinctiveness, and they're placed within bands. So you have your very high distinctiveness band, and they're your priority habitats that are generally quite scarce, or they don't have great protections in place and are highly threatened. Then you have your high distinctiveness band habitats. So they're priority habitats, but they're potentially already protected quite well, or they're a bit more common than your very high distinctiveness habitats. Then you've got your medium distinctiveness habitats. So they are semi-natural habitats, but they're not priority habitats, but they have a significant benefit to wildlife. You've got your low distinctiveness band habitats. So they're habitats of limited biodiversity value, but they've still got some biodiversity value. So things like grassland and cropland. And then you've got your very low distinctiveness band habitats. They're things with very little to negligible value for biodiversity. So urban land, sealed surface, things like that. So how do these translate into the trading rules? So very high distinctiveness habitats. The priority should be given to replacing units of those with the exact same type of habitat, if that's possible. Then you've got high distinctiveness habitats. They're the same, so the same habitat type exactly has to be replaced. This is a bit different when you get down to medium, where it's the same broad habitat type or high distinctiveness can be replaced. So by same broad habitat type, it doesn't have to be the exact same type of habitat, but it could be, say, replacing a grassland with another grassland that's medium distinctiveness. But then you can also replace it with a higher distinctiveness, like a high or very high distinctiveness habitat. Then you've got your low distinctiveness habitats, so they can be replaced with any habitat that's low or higher, so essentially anything that's not very low. And then your very low distinctiveness habitats just have no trading rules applied to them. So you've got rule 2. So that's that all the outputs associated with the metric are unique. So we've got the 3 different modules in the metric. We've got watercourses, hedgerows, and area habitats. They can't be summed or traded between them. So if you have a loss of hedgerows, you can't make up for that with a gain in watercourses. And also there's a 10% requirement for each of these modules. So if you have any of them at the baseline, you're required to deliver a minimum of 10% in that type of unit. And we've got rule 3, which is you have to use the correct tool. So at the moment, that's the statutory metric. So that has to be used now, unless you meet the requirements for the small sites metric, which are, I don't know them off the top of my head, but they're in the small sites metric guidance. So if you meet the requirements for that, you're also able to use those. Then we've got rule 4, which is that you are able to use rule 4 and deviate from the metric in very exceptional circumstances. So you can only do that if the site has optimal conditions for restoration of wildlife, rich or historic natural habitat. And in addition to that, the project team delivering the intervention has the expertise that kind of counteracts the difficulty multipliers that I spoke about. So that's for use in very rare circumstances, but there might be some situations where that's possible. So these situations can be, I think there's some on the next slide, Michael. So these can only be used where there's highly complex landscape scale habitat changes, such as creation of heathland, if there's river meandering taking place, or if there's large scale restoration of natural processes. There's a lot more detail on the use of rule 4 in the metric. So in summary, for the rules, I have rule 1, trading rules must be followed. Rule 2, outputs for a metric are unique and cannot be compared. So we've got watercourses, hedgerows, and area habitats. Rule 3, the correct tool must be used, statutory metric tool or small sites metric. And then rule 4 can only be used in exceptional circumstances where you have a clear ecological benefit and the LPA has to agree. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
Hi, thanks, Finn. So yeah, a warm welcome here to this introductory session on the Watercourses module. So my name is Sarah Scott and I'm a Senior Advisor in Biodiversity Net Gain in the Environment Agency. And just a little bit here on the development of the Watercourses module. So I started working on BNG in 2018 when I was dealing with a major development project in London. And it was the first time I'd heard the words biodiversity net gain. And it was also the first time I'd heard the words that it doesn't apply to rivers. So this didn't go down well, as you can imagine. And I started to do some work looking into this. And it was through this work that I ended up being seconded over to the Natural England metric team to lead the development of the rivers and streams metric for version 2. And I've proudly been involved ever since. So we've led from version 2 to the statutory metric. And the main aim was not to make it a scientific study of rivers, but applied. And I soon realised we needed a condition assessment that was flexible and practical for non-freshwater ecologists. And someone mentioned a catchment partnership meeting, a citizen science, say what you see assessment. And then the journey was started with Lucy Schuker and Angela Gunnell on the condition assessment. So now I'm going to speak a little bit about the ALBs. So just to note here that we're not statutory consultees. So much of our work between us will be about inputting to the guidance, the policy and the metric as it evolves and advising DEFRA. So this is very much a snapshot of our input, and further information on the ALB's role is provided in other training. So jointly, I suppose we want to maximise opportunities for nature through BNG. And how that is addressed might actually be through existing pathways. So it might be about work on protected sites, protected species, catchment partnerships, river basin plan, woodland management. So although your role might not be BNG specific, there may be links and opportunities, and we're using BNG as a vehicle to get those outcomes. So if we just have a little look about the Environment Agency, I mean, the Environment Agency is about maximising the opportunities provided as our role through our developer role, regulatory and advisory. And I said a lot of that's going to be through also catchment partnerships our work with the LNRSs and river basin plans. And if we go on to the next slide, we just have a little look at Natural England. And again, Natural England has a much broader role with net gain around operating the register and the credit sale. But also it's about those other opportunities around protected sites, protected species, irreplaceable habitats, and how the priority habitats work. And again, Forestry Commission, again, we have that input to the guidance, but also it's around those opportunities where BNG could help with natural flood management schemes, conservation of woodlands, floodplain, and also keeping rivers cool. Thank you. BNG Fit, we're delivering existing goals and drivers for water. And the outcomes can be seen in our environment improvement plan, the integrated plan for water, our own EA flood risk strategy. But the key area here, I think, for BNG is around physical modification. So 41% of all water bodies are affected by physical modification. So what is this? This is interventions that have physically changed the shape, the flow regime, the natural processes that occur within a river and its floodplain, or to be blunt, works that have basically knackered the river. Okay, so BNG can help reduce existing physical modifications. They can mitigate new impacts and hopefully, ultimately, help to create healthy and resilient river systems. But I would like to say that people think watercourses are really difficult to do in BNG, and I probably would say that's not the case. I think a lot of it is about perception. The rivers are difficult. What we've designed in the metric is fundamentally say what you see. It's not about kick samples, it's not about macrophytes, it's not about microscopes. Yes, it's new to many, but as it's applied, and I think as a community of practice develops, this nudge of working with rivers will occur. So I'm going to hand over now to Ollie, who's going to tell us everything we need to know about rivers.
Thanks, Sarah. No pressure. So yeah, I'm Oliver Grant. I work in the National Geomorphology team in the Environment Agency. Our team has a sort of strategic leadership role in river restoration and addressing some of those physical pressures on our water bodies, implementing sort of nature-based solutions, covering a wide range of work areas, so agriculture, flood risk management, water resources and spatial planning, and this is how we've become involved in biodiversity net gain. In my own experience with biodiversity net gain, I've been helping our internal colleagues, so our flood risk management teams, to incorporate biodiversity net gain into our capital projects and schemes, and also our other operations, and then supporting that guidance writing and changes of the ways we're working to provide support and training on biodiversity net gain. A number of my colleagues in the National Geomorphology team have been involved in the development of the Watercourses unit module, and specifically the river condition assessment, which underpins it. You might have heard of the MORPH surveys, which are a combination of field and desk-based modular surveys, which cover rivers and generate condition indicators. And these are really critical for us to be able to quantify the baseline and the future development outcomes and see if actually statutory biodiversity net gain has been achieved through developments. There's a whole host of external training available on the river condition assessment and MORPH surveys if you're likely to encounter that in your role, undertake an assessment or review the outputs of one. As a disclaimer, I've not been directly involved in the development of the Watercourses unit module or the river condition assessment, but I did draw the short straw and am presenting today. So not an expert, but some knowledge. So there's on this slide here, there's 5 guiding principles that we use within the National Geomorphology team and the Environment Agency to maximise outcomes when restoring rivers. There's other things to bear in mind. One is to address those physical modifications. So we saw in Sarah's previous slide that over 40% of water bodies are not achieving their environmental objectives due to physical modifications. So can we use biodiversity net gain to tackle this? Another one is managing pressures at the source, trying to tackle those underlying issues and not attempting to fix the sort of impacts that we see on the ground, but tackling it at source. And finally, to restore the natural processes and allow natural processes to do the work for us to create sustainable habitats. So the first of those principles is let nature do the work. The idea behind this principle is that we should use natural processes and the power of nature to drive river restoration wherever we can. This may involve doing very little, which we refer to as natural recovery, or giving it a nudge, which we can refer to as assisted natural recovery. And the key is that the interventions work with the natural processes and natural energy of rivers and require less intervention and are therefore more sustainable in the long term. The next principle is think bigger. This principle is that we should undertake restoration actions across whole landscapes. Resilient catchments are made up of lots of interconnected environments, and we need to think about the sediment and vegetation and organic materials, which are essential components of our aquatic environments, with the ultimate goal of working at the bigger system scale to deliver multiple benefits. It might be okay just to skip through to the couple more. Beyond now. Okay, yeah. So on to connect, which this principle considers restoring the connectivity between our different environments. We should give greater focus to restoring the connectivity between water, sediment, and water-dependent organisms through rivers and wetlands. And we should also prioritise removing barriers in these environments, so weirs and embankments, and connecting floodplains, the river subbed and groundwater. The next principle is give space and time. And this is about acknowledging that it takes time and space for watercourses to recover. We should make space for them and allow natural processes to create new physical habitat and for vegetation to grow and ecosystems to recover. Rivers require space to adapt to changes in energy and sediment supply and biology. So we need to give them that space, and allowing that space to change and accommodate natural fluctuations, which is key to sort of climate resilience and other resilience. And the final of the 5 overarching principles is planning and prioritizing. So we should be less opportunistic and more and take an increasingly planned approach to restoration, looking at catchment scale improvements, and restoration efforts should be increasingly coordinated and really placing the emphasis on planning for restoration, as we do with flow and water quality. The final slide of mine is just a summary of those 5 principles. I won't dwell on this, but if you do receive the slide pack after, it's very useful to refer to. And I'll hand back to Sarah, who's going to explain how we apply, or when we apply, biodiversity net gain to watercourses.
Thanks, Ollie. That was really useful, because I think just thinking about how rivers work should be how the metric works as well, in trying to reflect that. So I think that's really useful to go through. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk about when do we actually apply BNG to the watercourse. And essentially, it is when the red line boundary crosses into the river. So the key thing here is knowing what we mean by a river. So it's the channel, it's the banks, and it's this thing called the riparian zone. I think some people think of a river as being a pipe of water, but it does also include the riparian zone on the bank. So the riparian zone is the area 10 metres back from the bank top. And it's this zone that fundamentally influences the ecological function of the river. It's critical to how the river functions. It has inputs to the river of organic matter. It's an area of erosion and deposition. It's a wildlife corridor for species such as otters and bats, and it controls heat, so light and dark within the channel. So any development that goes into that zone triggers the watercourses module to be applied. The thing that I just wanted to flag here, my top tip for, well, where is a riparian zone? It's essentially where you think about building a shed. Okay, you wouldn't build a shed on the slopes, you'd be looking to build a shed where it's kind of where the bank slope sort of flattens out. So that's my top tip. Not that we want lots of sheds in the riparian zone. Okay, so I'm now going to talk to you about the component parts of the Watercourses module. And as you can see, the Watercourses module is similar to the area-based module. There shouldn't be anything here that is a worry or a concern. So the detail of each part is included in the user guide. And the dotted line here indicates areas that are input into the baseline. The only multipliers I think it's worth flagging here are 2 encroachment multipliers. So they are different. So that's riparian encroachment and watercourse encroachment. And they account for very specific interventions that materially affect, again, how the river functions. So why are they here? I guess sometimes development can have very subtle impacts on the river and the riparian corridor. And that might not necessarily be picked up in a broad scale condition assessment, as these are kind of fairly nuanced interventions. So, for example, the riparian encroachment broadly concerns how close is a development encroaching up to the top of bank, and it's in that riparian zone. So imagine the scene in 2005, and I'm stood on a riverbank with a developer, and the developer wants to kind of come 4 meters from the top of bank. I ask, get out, let's have 10 meters of this riparian zone. The developer says, okay, well, I'll come back and I'll just have 6 meters. Oh, okay, so we settle on 7. So there has been an impact there because they've encroached 7 meters in. There's no way of accounting for it. If I was lucky, I would have got like a bat box out of it. And what we wanted was development out of this zone fostered as a wildlife corridor. So the ecological pressure on that zone is very much now reflected in that multiplier. And that's why those multipliers are in there. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Lucy.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everybody for great introductions earlier. And so, yeah, I'm Lucy Shuker. I've been involved in the development of the river condition assessment and the MORPH survey when it started way back when, as citizen science methodology, all the way through to the point now where we're training lots of environmental professionals from all sorts of different backgrounds and disciplines to learn to do this very straightforward methodology to record what we see, to give them a basic foundation, understanding and knowledge, to give them that basic level of competency that's needed to do the condition assessment. So my slide here is basically going to talk a little bit about what's different for rivers and streams. And as Sarah's really nicely explained just now, that the river isn't just a thin blue line. The river as an ecosystem and a system of habitats, and as Ollie explained, is very dynamic. And we need to give space to rivers because they're a dynamic system. Water levels are changing. There's lots of materials moving through them, driven by the flow of water. And so we need to think about not just the habitats in the water, the wetted zone itself, but also what's to the side of them. So what's really important is that we remember that we're not double counting with the area habitats, but we're thinking about everything that contributes to that line. And this is what we're teaching people through the RCA professional accreditation training, to ensure that people who are coming from different disciplinary backgrounds have got that basic knowledge in order to be able to assess the condition at the baseline, and also think about and know what's going to be appropriate for that particular river in terms of what is achievable and it's appropriate for an improvement and an uplift in units at that site. So the 2 little diagrams here on the right of the slide basically capture how we look at rivers, how we're teaching people to do the assessment. You go and do your more field survey. We record what we see in short sections of a longer length of river, which is basically going to be entered into the biodiversity metric spreadsheet. And that short length is going to be representative of the section, and that section is going to have a consistent condition. And then we assess what we discover about those sections in relation to the river type, which is the diagram below. And this is the detail of what we learn on the training. So it's the right habitat for the right river type for that location. in terms of the way that the data are gathered and processed, again, there's a difference here. There's a data platform, the River Condition Information System, and this is hosted on a website that is managed by Cartographer. And if you do the River Condition Assessment training, you get access to this database where you can save data, and it's in a private workspace because people are obviously working on commercial projects, but data can very easily be shared as well from there, and people can share if they're working on collaborative projects, they can share with their colleagues, and all of these things. Very flexible system, deliberately so. So another difference is that we don't have a standard condition reporting sheet within the statutory instrument spreadsheet collection on the DEFRA website. I'm sure anybody who's involved in the area habitat assessments will know what I'm talking about, and if you don't, it's there on the DEFRA tools and guides collection, and you will have spotted that there's no sheet for rivers. We have produced something through the river condition assessment training, and that is available to everybody who does the training, and we're going to make it available for general sort of knowledge for people to understand what's being used for everybody soon, when we find a place to post some frequently asked questions. But fundamentally, it's a way to describe what the high level outputs are, and to help the reviewers of the metric to understand where those values are coming from. And it's also being used in the habitat monitoring and management plan as part of the template for reporting on the baseline and what will guide future monitoring. So that RCA reporting form is going to be available to everybody through RCA training and in the habitat modification management plan templates, and hopefully soon we'll have it somewhere in the public domain so that it's not something which is just restricted in availability. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Sarah now. I was going to talk a bit more about how we actually achieve that uplift.
Thanks, Lucy. I just wanted to put this slide on because I think quite a few people sometimes say, oh, it's quite difficult to achieve uplift with rivers. And I think sometimes we don't think about these 4 different types of way that you can actually achieve uplift. So let's start off. Distinctiveness. You can move distinctiveness band. Okay, so you could go from a culvert to the rivers and streams category by daylighting. You can go from an other rivers and streams category to a priority river habitat. So these are our most pristine rivers, and this is done through a naturalness assessment. So you're just making sure that the priority river is actually incredibly natural, and it should be. And it's not just about physical habitat. With naturalness, it's also looking at biology, chemistry, flow, and presence of invasive native species. So distinctiveness is really important. Lucy's just gone through condition. So we're looking at the whole kind of complex of works there going on with the river condition assessment. But then we've also got, as I've highlighted, these 2 other bands, these encroachment categories. So you've got riparian encroachment and you've got the watercourse encroachment. And again, just by altering these 2 multipliers, in some cases you can see gains, and that can also occur where condition and distinctiveness is static. And the other thing to mention about those encroachment ones, really think about that when you're on site. Those are things that you can quite readily look at improving. Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand back to Lucy.
Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, well, one of the big kind of questions is when we're training a lot of people who don't have a background in river restoration, geomorphology, or even maybe freshwater ecology. We really want to help people to achieve the competency in being able to do a condition assessment by getting them to understand the really important headlines about rivers and about how rivers function, to enable it to be the starting point of a journey and what we're trying to achieve in terms of improvements for rivers generally, which is nature-based, process-based restoration that will have longer-term sustainability. So we're pointing people towards all sorts of ways of understanding how rivers function in the catchment context. I'm a great believer in catchment-based approach and getting people to think about the whole catchment and how that might have an influence on what's happening at the local scale where your project site is actually located. We're really encouraging people to obviously get to grips with all of the guidance that's out there. There are a lot of resources, lots of other training opportunities, but fundamentally we want to get people down by the riverside and really looking at rivers. And this is what's been so wonderful about breaking down the barriers between different environmental disciplines, is that many of the environmental experts who've been involved for a long time on doing this kind of impact assessment and linking about biodiversity gain may not have actually had the reason to go down and look very closely at the river before, and they're really enjoying what they're learning when they get down there. And we encourage them to, let the river tell the story, get to know what the river's telling you, and to really then think about when you might need to ask for help and talk to other experts, because obviously we recognise we can't turn people into river experts overnight, but we give them a really firm foundation and get them to understand how much they can start to understand, and then where they might need to go and talk to others to support the decisions that they're making to improve these rivers. And if we go to the next slide, some of the resources that we're pointing people towards are some, excellent. I mentioned the catchment-based approach, the Rivers Trust hosted CABA website. That's a place that you can go to alongside of the Catchment Data Explorer, which many of you will be familiar with already, but you can go to the CABA site and quickly find who is your local catchment partnership host, and you can then get in touch with them, go to their website and get to the catchment action plans and find out what might already be a project that's in waiting to be delivered. So we're helping people to understand about these resources, also other training through like the River Restoration Centre on the left, all these things to get people thinking about what's happening upstream and downstream beyond the narrow confines of their site, in order that they can really understand better what to make as recommendations at the first point of the journey through biodiversity net gain to help achieve those better outcomes. It's really important also to think about those modifications in the past, which Sarah mentioned, and those river restoration opportunities, which others may already be thinking about. So breaking down those barriers, getting people to talk to others and get in contact where they're involved in already thinking about river restoration is part of this process.
Thanks, Lucy. So I just wanted to flag here, this is what we're aiming for. This is an output in the metric where we can put each section into the metric as a separate line. So this is an extract from the user guide, and I would really, really recommend that whenever you're out on site or you're trying to apply the Watercourses module, just have the Watercourses module of the metric with you. It's only 8 pages. It's really, really helpful. So as you can see, the project boundary here runs from point 1 to 4. Okay, so in many cases, we see the river being put in as one line. Okay, so instead of breaking it down, it's just put in as one line. And this is impossible to see the differences, the similarities, or if you wanted to spotlight areas of impact or opportunities. So it has to be broken down into these sections of what's happening. So as Lucy said, rivers tell really good stories. They could be about conflict, torture, romance, and the story needs to be told in the metric. So, for example, with this one, where's the torture here? It's in the culvert. Okay, there might be conflicts in one section if you had encroachment. There might be opportunities. I don't know, I'm going too far here, but romance, if there was something where you wanted to kind of restore the river. So you need to be thinking about that story and putting it in as these different sections. So next slide. The main thing here, as we said, is about reading the river and let it tell its story. So as we said, walking the site is critical to be able to understand the differences. And we've put take your thermos with you because, you might be out on site a bit longer. And it's in these differences that we apply these sections. So in this example, we had 4 sections. At the top, we've got an area where there is a weir. So that went in as one section. Then we had an area with a bridge that went in as another section. further down was an area that was retained. We don't want to do anything there, so that went as a discrete section. And then the last section is where actually we thought there could be a potential enhancement. So each section is a line within the metric. So with that, you have to have all the relevant information. So each section has its own encroachment kind of categorization, its distinctiveness, and its condition score. And I'm going to pause there and let Lucy just come in and mention about the condition when it comes into those sections. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. That's brilliant. Yeah, so if you imagine this image on the slide that we're looking at is part of a site, and the red ovals are your different sections, as Sarah's just described it, then for the condition assessment, we must make sure that we're representing the condition of each of those sections individually on the line within the metric tool itself. So we'll go in and there is a rule which is saying that we need to do at least 20% coverage of the length of that section with a morph survey. And that in most cases will fit very comfortably within the length of that section. You may in fact have to do a couple of the morph survey shorter lengths as samples, a bit like putting a quadrat over the river and recording everything that you see there. And then that's representative of the longer length. So in a way, you're extrapolating what you're seeing in a short length to the longer length. But what do we do if we've got a very short length? Well, in that case, we need to still record what we see. We need to adapt how we use the morph methodology and perhaps have discussions with other people that will be making decisions in order to make sure that we're really representing the condition of that length accurately. So it's an extrapolation in the other direction. And the most important thing is to remember what Finn was saying at the start, that it's about the relative value. We're not looking at an absolute value of condition, but it's really important that we get a good representation of how these different sections work alongside of each other in order that we can get a baseline and then predict an uplift where that's appropriate, etc. So use the tools as a guide to support the decisions that you'll be making, which will aim towards those ecological outcomes, which is what we're all, aiming to achieve without net gain anyway, but let net gain and the tools that are available help guide you on that journey. So what I wanted to really emphasize with this slide is that, it is a journey. It's the start of a journey. And when you're doing your metric assessment, on the left of the image here, we're doing our net gain watercourse assessment in the first instance. We're doing the condition assessment. We're doing all of the other things that Sarah's mentioned: distinctiveness, encroachment, strategic significance. And we're getting a good idea of the baseline, and we're going to then enable people from a wide variety of backgrounds to be able to do a forecast that is reliably supported by the evidence that they've gathered and an understanding of what's appropriate for that specific river type. But what we also emphasize is this is not detailed design, that there's many more stages to the process, many more people that you will need to engage with along that journey. Talk to catchment partnerships, get the advice from geomorphologists or other river experts. There may be people involved in the project who are doing engineering, and that's their priority because they need to protect infrastructure. There may be flood modelers that need to look at that from the risk assessment side, and there will most certainly on a main river definitely be permissions required too. So we're making that part of the learning for everybody to say it's not just you're not alone, because some people have been a little bit worried, I've learnt this condition assessment now, it's going to all be on my head, whatever I say is going to happen in this. Say, no, it's this is going to give you a firm foundation. It's a simple approach, it's sound, it's got evidence in there, and that evidence can be shared and discussed, and that is part of the journey towards detailed design that will end up as design and build. But there's quite a lot of stages to get through before you get to that point.
Thanks, Lucy. I just want to say a little bit about markets, and I think now that BNG has commenced, there is now kind of that thing about where can we actually go and deliver our river restoration schemes? Where can we get the units? So the market development of watercourse units has been slower than other markets. Rivers have been put, I think, in the too difficult box by early adopters. So it's been a bit slower to get off the ground. However, there is a demand for river units, and we're seeing this from some of the work that DEFRA commissioned last year. But on the ground, the feeling has changed. More market providers want to understand how to deliver river units, and more trusts, for example, Rivers Trusts, Wildlife Trusts, are also seeing how their schemes can become net gain delivery sites. So the emphasis is on the how, not the if, really. And otherwise, river restoration schemes can be costly, but not all. And I think understanding wider ecosystem service benefits that come from river restoration can mean that there can be blended finance schemes associated, with BNG becoming that all-important kind of seed funding if additionality rules are applied. So thinking about those wider benefits can be really, really beneficial. Things like flood regulation, climate resilience, water quality benefits, recreation, they all might have different investment options. So something to think about. I'm going to hand back now to Lucy. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I mean, just a very kind of quick summary now and a roundup of where you can go to get further information and training on all sorts of different aspects that will help to support our journey with the with this watercourse metric. It's a new element that's been brought in, so there's a lot of interest. It's quite a new frontier. There's lots of new approaches to river restoration, which are also becoming more widespread and discussed and acceptable. So it's a really exciting area of work to be involved in, and I would encourage everybody to be curious, embrace it, have a look at what's out there in terms of the training opportunities, the resources that you can access online, internally and externally. And also we're really keen to encourage everybody to get talking and become a community of good practice, so that we can all join together and we can get the best for our river ecology through this. So there's some pointers there on who you can go to: SAIM, cartographer, planning advisory service. On the training side, obviously you're having your internal training here as well. Lots of websites I've flagged up before. I think the next slide gives you even more detail, which follows on nicely from that one. We've got lots of links on here that you'll be able to go and explore at your leisure, all the way from the high level tools and guides there. As Sarah said, just the small bit that relates to the watercourses is a really handy pull out. Lots of information about river condition assessment on the Modular River Survey website. I am doing loads of courses across the board, and some specific ones for biodiversity net gain for watercourses. Lots of different ones relating to the specifics for rivers. Catchment Data Explorer, very good one. Rivers Trust, River Restoration Centre, British Society for Geomorphology as well. There's a whole community of experts out there, and I'm really keen on breaking down those barriers, as you'll be able to tell, between the disciplines to get the best for our integrated environment and environmental improvements. And last but not least, there's the Facebook community there for biodiversity net gain. If you haven't discovered it, you may not be a fan of social media, but if you have a quiet moment, it's quite interesting seeing the community-led conversations that are coming up. And now there's a specific group for watercourses. We're hoping to get something else out there too in the near future, not the social media one, but something where we can add all of the frequently asked questions for people. So I'll leave it there for now and hand back to Sarah and everybody else.
Thanks, Lucy. And thanks everyone who's presented. A really interesting story there. If I can just, before we go to review of the training and then go to questions, just a point on that library resources there, and my memory of a conversation with Lucy and Sarah about what happens next, and is it about passing on the baton as part of a relay race? And actually no, it's more a marathon. And yes, we've had the pacemakers in of the likes of Sarah, Lucy, other external stakeholders and other important input from Environment Agency colleagues as well. But now it's about others in the race, but for the long term. So when you look at that list there, don't think that you need to click on each of them now, but think about what you can do as part of your own continuing professional development, CPD, over the next year or so. Talk to your line managers about how you can learn more about rivers as part of your role, but also include it as part of your capacity, workload capacity and resource. So see those resources as part of your long-term learning rather than something that you need to just click on now and get on with. And remember what Lucy said as well, as that, you know, there's continued advice to be given from external stakeholders and also internally from Environment Agency as well. And in addition to that, once we break and go to questions, Siri Frost from the Environment Agency will tell you about advanced level training and watercourses that is being made available shortly. So more on that in a moment. But before we go to questions, just a review of what we've talked about in the last hour. We started with an overview of biodiversity net gain, the key points, our timeline after the 12th of February, and about the makeup of biodiversity units. We had an overview of the principles and rules of the statutory biodiversity metric, and then we talked about how biodiversity net gain is the same within watercourses and also where it differs. And then we ended with those further training resources. So again, my many thanks to our presenters today. A great story that's been told, and let the romance continue.